Hello, my name is Brandy Gilbert from Community Science, and I want to thank you for joining today's quick take around developing stronger leaders to advance equitable change. I'm joined here by two of my team members, Amber Trout, who has expertise in organizational and leadership development, change management, and capacity building for nonprofits and philanthropies. I also have here my colleague Brandon Coffey Borden. He has expertise in systems change, child and youth development, and also works around racial, economic, and health disparities.
All right, welcome everyone. I want to start off by asking you, why is leading with an equity lens so important, whether that's a racial, gender, or any other kind of equity lens?
Well, to me, it's because in so many areas of our society where leadership is exerted, the solutions to our most pressing problems are created without the critical knowledge of people of color and other diverse groups. And they often reflect solutions that may inadvertently contribute to the very inequities that they're seeking to address. So those solutions in the long term aren't going to hold a lot of value for really freeing communities from oppression and advancing justice. So you really need leaders of color at the table who are connected to, proud, and hopeful for the communities, that have the capacity to apply an equity lens. They're integral to making the change that are needed for true justice. There's robust advocacy for everything from policing reform to immigrant rights. But if those advocates and leaders don't appropriately reflect the communities most affected by those issues and aren't able to consider the equity impacts of their actions, then their activities are going to mirror and may perpetuate the power imbalances, the inequities, the patronizing approaches that plague so many of our systems today. So really, at the end of the day, the perspectives, the voices, the determination of communities of color are critical to the implementation of any kind of meaningful and durable reform. And that really requires an equity perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just love that you brought that up, Brandon, because I totally agree. I mean, having leadership development programs is, yes, getting leaders and leaders of color at the table, but it's how to do it, right? And that's why it's critical to have an equity, racial equity, gender equity, like you mentioned, like how to operationalize it. So even when the solution is there, what are the steps to get there? Who's benefiting and who's not? And really co-creating that table, making sure that table is not created before people are invited to it. So equity is really like the structure, right? And the processes that you put in place to have that like inclusiveness. And that's really what's important that happens in that leadership development program with a racial equity lens. Also just challenging who gets to be a leader. I think that's really important to see the range of leadership styles required for the different movements and community solutions and organizational solutions. Because if we keep sticking with the charismatic leader, that's not sustainable and it's just individualistic, which means there's no room at the table. So I just appreciate that question. Thanks, Brandy.
Yeah, thanks, Amber, for also really breaking down that structural piece. Sometimes equity feels like that thing that comes in later, that people lay on the side or lay on the top of their programs. And so thank you both for weighing into that. So speaking of this, what would you say is different about a general leadership program compared to one where there's an explicit intentional focus around equity? What's different in the sauce?
I mean, the first thing I think about is the we space. How do we do it together? Traditional leadership programs often focus on how do we invest in the individual, give that one person all the capacities and skills, and make that the unit of change. That one person alone can change an organization or a community. And we know that's just not realistic. It's not sustainable. And as Brandon was talking about, it's not inclusive of the knowledge of the people most affected. So really what is different is how do you create that we space as a leader? So how do you have that deep empathy? How do you know when it's your role to be leading versus when is it about bridging and stepping back? So I think that's really the difference in challenging and understanding how power is wielded, right? So with a traditional program, right, it's that individual, they come in and say, this is how we're going to lead change. And what we're hoping is with a leadership program centering equity. It's how do we do this together? What is everyone's ideas? And really understanding who's benefiting from the incremental change. Is it still the majority group? Is it still really those that are following the dominant culture? Or as we were talking about earlier, is it the people of change? Is it the people of color? Is it women? Who gets to benefit from these changes because of the equity lens? So I think that's really important to understand how that power is used to either open up opportunities or close them down. I think that's one of the difference and why it's so important kind of question.
And how do we hold space for if people might have multiple identities or the beneficiaries or multiple types of beneficiaries, kind of going back to what you were saying, Amber?
So are you saying like, how you could also like, I'm from a lower class and a white woman and how to lead from that space?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also important. And I know Brandon and I, we always talk about what's the balance, right? With how much transformational and understanding your identity and how I've grown up in with a working class kind of perspective and how that informed how I want to lead, in addition to the privilege I've had as a white person, right? And how that what I assume is possible may not be reality. So there's the reflecting of that and the intersectionality, knowing that's just a piece of the experience, but also having that reflective piece to know, but there's so much more, right? And other perspectives I need to engage to think about a solution, right? And so I think that's one way to acknowledge the intersectionality. I have a piece of the perspective, but not all of the perspective. And just given the privilege I have being part of the majority group, right? What other things, those questions Brandon was raising for who benefits, right? And so it's important to know how to navigate that. But we talk about balance, and Brandon, I'll let you talk about this, is really, but also when is it transactional? And it really is a set of skills of implementing an action plan you agree upon. Once you understand how you want to show up in the space as a leader, right? And create that we space. I don't know, Brandon, if you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that, I think you really hit on both, what I think is the unique aspect of a leadership development program. And then also to Brandy's question about how do you address intersectionality in people who hold multiple identities. And I think it really is about what the core a leadership development program that's focused on the application of equity lens is trying to bring to the table versus another kind of standard program, right? I think at its best, it's going to be a transformative experience that really tries to cultivate a leader's capacity to inspire others, to support, to reflect on their own identities, whatever they might be, as well as to do some of the day-to-day work that they may be doing, planning, decision-making, allocating resources, but all with the goal of trying to create more equitable policies and programs. So really, it's grounded. I think as you spoke to earlier, Amber, it's not just grounded in individual aspects of leadership, but also a set of principles and reflection and processes that focus on the individual, but also the group and institution, and then also systems, right? Yes. Because it's really those changes at those other ecological levels that really lead to lasting change. And so ideally, the program is going to help participants, as you spoke to, Amber, really be better equipped to deconstruct what's not working around equity, support and amplify what is working around equity, shift the way that leaders are making decisions and thinking about their work, both individually and collectively. And then really also, I think, and Amber, you touched on this, really providing space and tools to heal, around those different identities that we bring to the table, as you mentioned, Brandy. Ideally also transform the organizations and the structures and the environments that leaders are a part of.
Thank you.
It makes me think of this story of one of these programs I was evaluating of what is the scale of change and what can change look like as a leader. And this particular person, it started off, to the outsider, could seem like an art project of completing, but they're called buffalo skulls. And it was a leader working with his community, his indigenous community, of just painting buffalo skulls to connect with their culture, with the community. And really it was an opportunity to start connecting, getting that interconnectedness, which I know, Brendan, you talked about. And then how do you get that collective agenda just over time? Instead of like, here's our window, we have to know what it is. You're just building and norming, and what do we want as a community? And everyone's a leader in that moment. So when one person of that community does have that window of opportunity, there's a shared agreement already as what does our community want? What's the change we need? What's the solutions, right? Getting back to your original statement that the community knows and has a local knowledge. And so it's just examples like that of thinking of what change can look like and what leadership can look like. It's very different in different contexts, and that's okay. That's what's so exciting about it.
Thank you. Thank you. And for you both, on the flip side of that, you shared what you found rewarding. What did you find most challenging?
What's challenging is aligning what a funder would like to see out of a leadership development program versus what's reality. So what can happen in a year in a program? Is what can one individual do? Especially when often funders don't invest in the capacity of an organization of that leader who's going through the leadership development program. So there's this disconnect. The leader comes with this skill set and new language into their organization or community, and now they can't talk to each other because the language is different, and the organization and that leadership in there, they haven't been on the same journey, so they're not ready. I think, and what's difficult with that also is when you're working with the implementation team and the funder, is change is experienced different by the leader who's pushing it. So often you see white people or people who identify as white, when they're pushing change, it goes faster in their organization versus a leader of color who is either one of the few people of color in the organization. There's more resistance, there's more challenging. Are you skilled? Can you lead this? And so how do you communicate and have that dialogue as the evaluator? How do you talk to the implementer about, hey, we're noticing these patterns across different identities, even geography? If you're from a smaller town versus a more dense city, the scale of change looks different. So aligning the strategy and also acknowledging there's nuance in the individuals pushing the change. It's just a hard conversation to have, but it's also exciting again, because if you could figure out how to get through that conflict again, that's like keeping that eye on the prize on the system level change that you want to have.
Thank you. I appreciate you talking about how to balance both the system and some of the individual pieces, and both the funder and some of the programmatic and on the ground pieces. Brandon, any other thoughts to add there?
Yeah, I think Amber, you made great points. I think one of the things that you mentioned about thinking about the balance of what can one person accomplish, especially if the conditions in which they're leading are not such that they facilitate their ability to create change, right? So I think one of the challenges from an evaluation standpoint is often a long-term follow-up, right, with participants to really be able to understand what impacts a given program is having over the long term. And then what are those contextual challenges that leaders are experiencing even after they exit the program that might be preventing them from fulfilling some of the goals that they're setting out to achieve.
Yeah, that makes me think, like, for the funders being prepared that some leaders might actually leave, right, their organization that they're working at as a result. And that is success, just a different success. I just felt like that's where you were going, which also made me think evaluation has been historically harmful to communities. And so you were just making me remember, like, the importance of acknowledging that when interacting with the leaders and really being clear why you're collecting the data, where they could provide, their feedback on if we collected it and are representing their voice correctly. Because that is a big, big, big challenge, is trusting the evaluators, the evaluation, and how the data is going to be used.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Thinking about how individual choices and decisions are going to change over the long term, right? Like you're absolutely right that sometimes a leader, if they're in a space that is really taxing on them, if they are, or their experience in the program makes them realize that, this isn't for me. Over the long term, they may choose to go to a different organization. Over the long term, they may choose to enter a different field. And to me, in a way, that goes back to thinking about the theory of change for a given program and what are the outcomes you're really trying to achieve. If 4 out of 10 of the leaders who participate in the program, for example, end up leaving the field after 5 to 10 years, what implications does that have on the program's ability to achieve its long-term outcomes? And again, that goes back to why I think it's so important to be able to do that follow-up over the long term, and that continuous feedback loop and process of strategy improvement is what's going to allow a program to refine its theory of change over time. And I think another thing that you mentioned earlier, Amber, which is so important, is and often a challenge for evaluation is this issue of contribution versus attribution.
Yep.
At its best, an equity-focused program is going to contribute to organizational and systems change. But there's always a challenge in appropriately identifying the program's contribution to those kinds of changes in the face of all this happening in complex environments and trying to tease that out.
That's so true. And just teaching the term, like the concept of system, I'm not sure we're there yet in the leadership development program field. Like, how do you teach system? How do you teach system change? How do you then, once you could see your points, your lever points, take action in your sphere of influence? I think that's still something we're working towards to operationalize it. I think there's the lens, and then what do you do? Like we are with equity. Now that we understand how to apply the racial equity, gender equity lens, what are the steps to take? And I think there's work to be done with that systems lens too. And I know you're always talking about that, Brandon, when we're talking about leadership development.
No, I mean, I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. It's critical.
Yeah, thanks for that. And in wrapping up, for our listeners who may be either part of leadership programs, leading leadership programs themselves, or funding them, or just have a general interest in them, if people might walk away with just a couple of takeaways, like don't leave without knowing this first, what would you want them to know?
If I had to pick a couple of things, I think, one is I really think it's important to provide space for both self and collective care. I think leaders, especially those that are working to advance equity and social justice, they're going to be susceptible to burnout at any point in life if they don't intentionally develop a plan for loving and taking care of themselves. I think leaders working in that space often buy into this myth that if they're not out constantly, doing the real work, that they're failing their followers, that they're failing their community. But I think leaders have to recognize that caring for themselves is not an act of self-indulgence. It's an act of self-maintenance, an act of self-preservation. And that's critical to engage in that, to be able to continue to do the work over the long term. And I think there is a place where even after a program experience is over, an alumni network can help facilitate, holding individual leaders kind of accountable, quote unquote, for making sure they're taking care of themselves, as well as providing that space for collective care. And I think the other thing I would stress, and I know this has come up in the conversation, it's just that leadership is not about individuals. It's about groups. In many situations, leaders come together to help produce social change through their interactions. And historically, a lot of leadership development programs have not fully recognized that it's groups of leaders, as well as the dynamic between leaders and their followers, that together creates lasting change.
Thank you. And it sounds like that's especially important right now as we're recording this in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and many other stressors that our country and our world is facing right now. Thank you. Amber?
Yeah, that was just beautifully said. It's really debunking the myth that, nonprofits are just sectors willing to throw away leaders let the burnout go. And that is what's powerful about leadership development programs, right? Like you're saying, that maintenance. And I think it's also, for me, my takeaways are, is you're a leader already. And you're making decisions every day on how to lead your life. And those little decisions affect people. So it's really amplifying, what is my role in this moment? Everyone has a different way of leading. Everyone has a different skill set. So a leader can't do every aspect. And that's actually what's kind of rad and awesome, is finding your lane, right? That's what leadership programs help you find your lane and how you're contributing to change. And I agree with Brandon, having that peer network, that alumni, to then realize, who do I work with? And then who helps me stay in balance of that self-maintenance. And I think also for evaluators, saying, looking in the mirror and saying, you're a leader. And you're a leader in this evaluation, and saying, hey, what is this moment really calling for? Yep, we could do a midpoint check and a baseline. And yes, it's important to check for what skills have changed, but what else? Like, what is this moment calling for? What is the changing world, with the elections coming up, with living through a collective trauma of the pandemic, with all of the racial uprisings coming up? Like, what is this moment calling for as an evaluator? And how do you capture what a range of leadership looks like, different metrics, and just keep putting yourself out there? And not everything's going to work, but you're part of the team. And I think really, for me, the last point is, how are you building capacity with whoever you're working with? So getting back to, like, you're a leader, and how are you contributing to others to see the leader already in themselves? Really getting at what Brandon was saying with the followers and having influence, is how are you building that team so it's not always you? Because also part of self-maintenance is having a team, and you're rotating out who's leading, right? So, and then the influence comes with multiple people knowing their roles on doing it. So just don't be afraid to see yourself as a leader, asking yourself, what is this moment calling for whom, and what can I do? What actions can I take, and who am I doing it with collectively?
Thank you. Thanks for those insights on self-care, and especially around burnout issues, and for some key questions that we can ask ourselves and ask our teams. Anything else you all want to share?
I mean, I think the best part is, like, talking with you all about that, and us pushing our envelopes as evaluators, and just having this chance to do it. So just appreciate this moment, hanging out, and just kind of really thinking about what's next.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's been a really good conversation, and it certainly brought up a lot of issues to reflect on for me in this work. So I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks to both of you.